Just after midnight in several Gulf countries, warning sirens began to sound. Radar systems across the Middle East suddenly detected something moving fast across the sky. Dozens of objects launched from Iranian territory. Within minutes, military commands in multiple countries were scrambling to confirm what they were seeing. Ballistic missiles. Not one or two, but a coordinated wave. Several U.S. military installations across the region immediately went into emergency defense mode. Air defense systems activated. Personnel rushed into hardened bunkers. Fighter jets were placed on standby. Then the explosions began. Iran had launched a large missile strike targeting American military bases in the Middle East. The attack marked one of the most dangerous moments in the rapidly escalating confrontation between Tehran and Washington. And it did not come out of nowhere. The strike was part of a rapidly unfolding war that had already pushed the region closer to open conflict than it had been in decades. To understand why Iran launched these missiles and why U.S. bases became the target, we need to go back just days earlier. The crisis began when the United States and Israel launched coordinated military operations inside Iran. The campaign targeted Iran's military infrastructure, including missile facilities, naval assets, and parts of the country's defense industry. Washington described the operation as a necessary step to weaken Iran's missile capabilities and stop what it claimed were growing security threats in the region. Tehran saw it very differently. For Iran's leadership, the attacks were seen as direct aggression against the country's sovereignty, and Iran's response came quickly. Instead of targeting only Israeli positions, Iran widened the battlefield. Missiles and drones were launched towards several countries where American military forces operate. These strikes hit or targeted U.S. bases in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Some of the most significant targets included Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East. At least one Iranian ballistic missile struck near the base, according to regional defense officials. Other missiles and drones were intercepted by regional air defense systems before reaching their targets. But even when interceptions are successful, the message behind the attack remains clear. Iran was signaling that U.S. forces across the region are within reach, and the scale of the strike suggested that this was not just a symbolic retaliation. According to analysts tracking the conflict, Iran launched hundreds of missiles and drones during the early waves of its response campaign. Pentagon estimates indicate that more than 500 ballistic missiles and over 2,000 drones were fired during the first phase of Iran's retaliatory attacks. That level of firepower shows the enormous missile capability Iran has spent decades building. Iran's missile program is one of the largest in the Middle East. It includes short-range missiles designed for nearby targets, medium-range systems capable of reaching Israel and U.S. bases across the Gulf, and increasingly advanced drones. For years, this missile arsenal has been at the center of tensions between Iran and its rivals. Israel has repeatedly warned that Iran's growing missile force represents a direct threat. The United States has imposed heavy sanctions over the program, and Gulf countries have invested billions in missile defense systems specifically designed to stop Iranian weapons. But even the most advanced defenses cannot stop everything. When dozens or hundreds of missiles are launched at once, the goal is often to overwhelm interception systems. This strategy is known as saturation. If enough missiles are fired simultaneously, some will inevitably get through. That is the basic logic behind Iran's missile strategy. And it is exactly the scenario that American military planners have worried about for years. The attack on U.S. bases also carried a major political message. Iran was not simply responding to Israeli airstrikes. It was directly challenging the United States. By targeting American installations across the Gulf, Tehran was signaling that any war involving Iran will not stay confined to one country. Instead, it would spread across the entire region. This is particularly significant because the Middle East hosts a large network of U.S. military facilities. There are major air bases in Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. Naval installations in Bahrain host the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Smaller bases and logistical hubs exist across Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. Together, these bases form the backbone of America's military presence in the Middle East. They allow the United States to project power across the region, but they also create vulnerable targets. And Iran has made it clear for years that in the event of war, those bases would be among its primary targets. In fact, Iranian military commanders have openly warned that American forces stationed in the region would face retaliation if Iran were attacked. Now that warning has become reality. The first waves of missiles have already demonstrated how quickly the conflict can escalate. But the most important question remains unanswered. Was this Iran's full response or just the beginning? Because historically, Iran's military strategy relies on multiple layers of retaliation: direct missile strikes, proxy attacks from allied militias, drone operations, cyber warfare, and economic disruption, especially in the oil-rich waters of the Persian Gulf. All of these tools remain on the table. Meanwhile, the United States now faces a critical decision: how to respond. And that decision could determine whether this conflict stops at missile exchanges or turns into something far more dangerous. Because once American forces come under direct attack, history shows that retaliation usually follows. As the first reports of the missile strikes spread across the region, military command centers from Washington to the Persian Gulf moved into crisis mode. U.S. Central Command began assessing the damage. Early intelligence focused on three critical questions: how many missiles were launched, which bases were successfully hit, and whether American personnel had been killed, because that final factor could dramatically shape the next move. Historically, attacks that cause U.S. military casualties almost always trigger a powerful response. For hours after the strikes, satellite imagery, radar data, and reports from troops on the ground were analyzed. Some missiles had been intercepted by Patriot and THAAD missile defense systems deployed around key bases. Others had fallen short or landed in remote areas, but several explosions were confirmed near American installations. At Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, one of the most strategically important U.S. bases in the Middle East, emergency crews responded to blast impacts on the outer perimeter. In Kuwait, defense systems reportedly intercepted multiple incoming missiles aimed at facilities hosting American forces. Naval radar systems in the Persian Gulf also tracked several missiles traveling toward areas near Bahrain, home of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. While some missiles were destroyed mid-air, others managed to reach their intended zones. Even limited damage carries enormous consequences in a crisis like this. Because once missiles start hitting bases, the conflict crosses a major threshold. For decades, the United States and Iran have engaged in indirect confrontation, proxy wars, sanctions, cyber operations, covert actions. But direct missile strikes on U.S. military bases represent a much more dangerous level of escalation. And in Washington, policymakers were already debating how to respond. The Pentagon has several options. One possibility is a limited retaliatory strike against Iranian military targets connected to the missile launch. That could include missile bases, drone launch facilities, or command centers operated by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Another option would be to target Iran's proxy networks across the region. Militia groups in Iraq and Syria that have historically operated with Iranian backing could become immediate targets for U.S. airstrikes. But there is also the possibility of a much broader response. Iran's missile infrastructure is spread across multiple locations, many of them buried deep inside mountains or reinforced underground facilities. Destroying those sites would require a sustained military campaign. And once a campaign of that scale begins, controlling escalation becomes far more difficult. That is why the first hours after an attack like this are so critical. Diplomatic channels often work quietly behind the scenes to prevent a situation from spiraling. Allies begin communicating. Back-channel messages are passed. Warnings are delivered. Sometimes these behind-the-scenes conversations succeed in slowing the pace of retaliation, but sometimes they fail. Meanwhile, the global implications of the crisis were already becoming visible. Oil markets immediately reacted to the news. The Persian Gulf handles a massive portion of the world's energy supply. Any conflict involving Iran raises fears that shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz could be disrupted. Even the possibility of naval conflict in those waters can send oil prices climbing rapidly. Financial markets across Asia and Europe also responded nervously. Investors understand that a major Middle East war could have global economic consequences. But beyond the markets, the real concern lies in how many players could be pulled into the conflict. Iran does not operate alone in the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon remains one of the most powerful non-state military forces in the world. Armed groups in Iraq and Syria have already launched attacks on U.S. bases in the past. The Houthi movement in Yemen has demonstrated its ability to strike long-distance targets using drones and missiles. If Iran signals its allies to open multiple fronts, the conflict could spread rapidly. Israel would almost certainly become involved. American forces across the region could face attacks from several directions at once, and that is the scenario military planners fear most. A regional war stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. At the same time, Iran's leadership must also weigh the risks. Tehran knows that a direct war with the United States carries enormous danger. The U.S. military possesses overwhelming air and naval power. American bombers, aircraft carriers, and advanced strike systems could severely damage Iran's military infrastructure. Iran's strategy has traditionally relied on avoiding direct confrontation while using asymmetric tactics to pressure its adversaries. But the missile strike on U.S. bases suggests that Tehran was willing to take a significant step beyond that approach. Whether it intended a limited signal or a broader escalation remains unclear. What happens next will likely depend on the scale of the damage from the initial strikes. If American casualties are minimal, Washington may choose a carefully measured response designed to avoid a full war. If the casualties are significant, the pressure for a much stronger military reaction will grow. And in conflicts like this, momentum can build quickly. One missile strike leads to retaliation. Retaliation leads to counter-retaliation. Retaliation leads to counter-retaliation. And before long, both sides may find themselves locked in a conflict neither originally intended to start. For now, the situation remains fluid. Military forces across the Middle East are on the highest level of alert. Missile defense systems remain active. Naval forces are repositioning in the Persian Gulf, and intelligence agencies are watching closely for signs of further launches. Because if another wave of missiles appears on radar screens, the next phase of this crisis could begin almost immediately. And the decisions made in the coming hours may determine whether this moment becomes a brief confrontation or the opening chapter of a much larger war.